The wind screamed like a wounded animal, its icy claws scraping across the barren plains, carrying with it the bitter sting of snow and dust. Clara Rollins fought against the storm, each step a battle as she dragged her body through the knee-deep snow. Her breath came in ragged gasps, clouding in the frigid air. She had no idea how long she had been walking, no idea how much farther she could go. Her coat, once thick and warm, was now nothing more than a flimsy shield against the cold. Her hands, numb and raw, gripped the strap of her carpet bag, the only possession she had left. Everything else had been lost: the farm, her husband, her hope. The world around her had swallowed it all, leaving her with nothing but the desperate need to survive. Alone, cold, hungry, a sharp pain stabbed at her chest, not from the cold, but from the gnawing emptiness that had settled inside her. As the storm grew fiercer, Clara could barely see past the snow that whipped around her, blurring everything in a haze of white. Her legs burned with exhaustion, but she pushed forward, driven by a single thought: find shelter. And then, through the thick snow, a figure appeared. A tall man, framed by the fading light of the storm. A cowboy. His silhouette was strong and imposing, a contrast to the fragile, broken woman struggling against the elements. He was on horseback, the creature's hooves pounding the frozen ground with purpose, cutting through the snowstorm like it was nothing. As he drew closer, his sharp eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. His gaze was steady, calculating, like he had seen the harshness of the world and come to understand its rules. "You're lost," he said, his voice low, a deep rumble that cut through the wind. Clara could barely speak, her throat dry, her lips cracked. Was this it? Was this how it ended? Cold, alone, in a world that had already turned its back on her? He dismounted, his movements slow but deliberate. Clara took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to run, but her body, weak from hunger and exhaustion, wouldn't obey. "You need shelter," he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "I can offer that, but it's not for free." Her heart pounded, not just from the cold, but from the tension in his words. A deal. She had no choice but to accept. Survival demanded it. But at what cost? Clara nodded, too tired to argue, too desperate to refuse. She followed him to his cabin, her mind racing, unsure of what to expect, but certain of one thing: she was no longer alone. And in the silence between them, the unspoken promise of something more lingered, something darker, something she could feel stirring within her, even as she tried to shut it out. Was he a savior or a predator? The door to the cabin creaked open, and as the warmth from the fire hit her frozen skin, Clara realized the storm outside wasn't the only thing she needed protection from. The wind howled louder as the door to the cabin creaked shut behind them, the sound echoing like a warning through the cold, wooden walls. Clara stood in the center of the room, the warmth from the fire flickering on her frozen skin, but it did little to ease the coldness that gripped her chest. She could feel Jackson's presence behind her, strong and steady, like the mountain he had ridden in on. His boots made no sound as he moved closer, his silhouette cast in sharp relief against the flames. The cabin was small, the walls thick and old, the sound of the fire crackling filling the otherwise oppressive silence. But it wasn't the storm outside that made her uneasy. It was the man in the room with her. She glanced over her shoulder, catching his gaze for just a moment. His eyes were like ice, cold and calculating, but there was something more beneath them, something she couldn't name. He didn't speak, just stood there, as if waiting for her to make the first move. The space between them felt charged, too tight, too thick with tension to breathe. She took a step back, instinctively retreating into herself, but there was nowhere to go. The walls were too close, the fire too warm, the air too still. Jackson's eyes followed her every movement, his posture unyielding, like he was both a protector and a predator, watching, waiting. She could feel the weight of his presence, like a physical force pressing against her. He didn't move. He didn't have to. Clara's breath hitched, the cold air of the cabin mixing with the warmth of the fire in her lungs, making her feel both alive and suffocated at the same time. She didn't know how long they stood there, the space between them thickening with every second. It wasn't until the wind outside howled again, louder this time, that Jackson spoke. "You're safe here," he said, his voice low and steady, like the rumble of distant thunder. But don't mistake that for kindness. His words hung in the air, a warning wrapped in a promise. Clara didn't move. The heat from the fire seemed to pulse against her skin, but it couldn't chase away the feeling of being trapped in a cabin, in a world of snow and wind, with a man who held her fate in his hands. She swallowed, her throat dry from the cold, from the tension that coiled tighter with every passing second. "I'm not here to beg," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, though it shook with something more than the chill in the air. She could feel the sharpness of his gaze on her, weighing her, measuring her. "You don't have to beg," Jackson said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "But you'll have to give something in return." His tone was blunt, like the crack of a whip, but there was no malice in it, just the cold, undeniable fact of survival in this godforsaken place. Clara stood there, heart racing, her pulse loud in her ears. The walls seemed to close in on her as she looked at him, his posture still and unyielding, but something in his eyes betrayed him. He was waiting for her to make a choice. She turned away from him, her mind racing, her body trembling with a mix of fear and something else, something deeper, something she couldn't quite place. She had no choice but to stay, no place to go in this storm, and no way of knowing what would come next. But she had to know. "I'll do what I must to survive," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "But I won't give more than that." The fire crackled louder in the silence that followed, the warmth of the flames dancing in Jackson's eyes. He took a slow step toward her, closing the gap between them. But still, he didn't touch her. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. Clara could feel the pull between them, the tension thickening. In the air, the desire, the protection, the control. Everything was hanging by a thread, and she wasn't sure if she wanted to cut it or hold on. As he stopped just behind her, his breath warm against the back of her neck, the world outside seemed to vanish. The only thing left was the weight of his presence, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and the growing desire to know what would happen next. What would this man, this cowboy, do with her now? Clara stood frozen by the fire, her body trembling not from the cold, but from the weight of Jackson's presence. The cabin, small and dimly lit by the flickering flames, suddenly felt even smaller, suffocating. She had come here seeking refuge, but now the very walls seemed to close in on her, threatening to trap her in a life she was no longer sure she wanted. Jackson's figure loomed large in the doorway, his eyes fixed on her, unblinking. He hadn't moved since she'd spoken. He didn't need to. His silence was enough. His presence was a weight she could feel pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She couldn't decide if she wanted to run, or if she was already too far gone to escape. "You're not like the others, are you?" she whispered, her voice barely above the crackling of the fire. Her gaze lingered on the floor, unable to meet his. Her hands, clenched tight against her sides, betrayed the war raging inside her. Jackson took a step forward, his boots making a soft thud against the wooden floor, but he stopped just short of her. "What do you mean?" His voice was calm, low, yet there was something in it, a quiet command, a challenge. Clara's heart hammered in her chest as her eyes met his for the briefest moment. There was no warmth in them, just cold, unflinching control. And yet, for some reason, she couldn't tear her eyes away. "You're not here to help," she said, the words slipping from her lips before she could stop them. "You're here to keep me trapped." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with truth. Jackson didn't flinch. He didn't move. He simply watched her, the space between them thickening with unspoken understanding. Clara felt the cold creeping back into her bones, not from the snow outside, but from the tension in the room, the isolation, the choices she had no power over. "You think I don't know what this is? You think I don't know why you're doing this?" Her voice wavered, but she didn't look away. "I'm nothing but a burden to you." Jackson's jaw tightened, the only sign that her words had struck a chord. He took another slow step closer, until there was barely a breath's distance between them. Clara's pulse quickened, the air between them charged with an unspoken battle. Her body screamed to retreat, but her feet stayed rooted to the ground. "You're wrong." Jackson's voice was a low growl now, the weight of his words pressing in on her. "I don't do this out of pity. I do this because I'm keeping you alive. And you'll either accept that, or you'll find yourself out there in that storm, left to freeze." The finality in his voice was like a lash, snapping through the last of Clara's resolve. Her breath caught in her throat as she fought to steady herself. The fear that had been building up since she'd stepped into his world now pressed against her ribs, a suffocating weight. He wasn't lying. He would leave her out there. He was in control, and she had no choice but to play his game. She stepped back, her heart pounding against her chest. And what happens when I stop playing? When I stop doing what you want? Jackson's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something dark passing through them. You're already playing, Clara, he said, his voice dangerously calm. The moment you walk through that door, you made your choice. The question now is, how long are you willing to keep fighting it? The cabin was silent except for the crackle of the fire, and Clara's mind raced, torn between survival and defiance. She wanted to push him away, to run, but deep down, she knew she didn't have the strength to face the storm outside alone. Not anymore. And yet, she could feel something else stirring within her. Something that wanted to resist. Something that refused to be caged, no matter how much the world around her pressed in. She wasn't sure if it was pride, or fear, or something more primal, but the urge to fight, to be more burned through her like fire. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze once more. You think you have all the control, she said, her voice stronger now, despite the fear. But we both know, sooner or later, the storm will make its choice too. Jackson's expression hardened, and for a moment, it seemed as if time itself held its breath. Then, without a word, he turned away, leaving her with nothing but the silence, the fire, and the cold weight of his unspoken promise. But Clara knew something had changed in that moment. She had given him control, and now, she was going to take it back. The wind howled through the cracks in the cabin, the cold seeping deeper with every gust. As Clara stood by the fire, her hands clenched into fists. The flames flickered and danced, casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. The room was heavy with the weight of silence, broken only by the soft creak of the logs shifting under the strain of the storm outside. Jackson stood across from her, unmoving, his eyes never leaving her face. There was something about the stillness of the moment that made the air feel thick, almost suffocating. Clara's chest tightened as she stared at him. Her throat was dry, and though the fire's warmth touched her skin, it didn't seem to reach the coldness growing inside her. She had been given a choice. Or at least, that's what she thought. But the more she thought about it, the less it felt like a choice at all. Her eyes flickered to the door, to the endless storm outside, to the emptiness beyond. Would she be better off out there, freezing to death on her own terms, or staying in this cabin, under Jackson's watchful, suffocating control? Her heart beat faster, a mixture of fear and something else she couldn't quite name. Fear of being trapped, of being forced into a life she didn't want. Fear of him, the way his presence seemed to fill the room, leaving her with no space to breathe. And yet, there was something magnetic about him, something that pulled at her, even as she resisted it. I won't stay here if you keep treating me like a prisoner, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried across the room like a gunshot in the silence. Jackson didn't flinch. He didn't move. His eyes, cold and steady, never left hers. The way he watched her, it was like he was assessing her, measuring her every word, every movement. It unsettled her, but at the same time, it anchored her in place. You're not a prisoner, Clara, Jackson said, his voice low, calm, but with a steel edge that made her pulse race. But you'll have to learn that safety doesn't come without a price. Clara's throat tightened as she swallowed the words she wanted to say. She took a step back, her body instinctively pulling away from the heat of the fire, but she could feel him closing the distance, his presence becoming overwhelming, inescapable. You can't keep me here if I don't want to be kept, she said, the words sounding weaker than she'd intended, as if she were already trying to justify herself. Jackson took a step forward, his boots silent against the wooden floor. I'm not keeping you, Clara, he said quietly, the intensity of his gaze never leaving her face. I'm protecting you. From yourself, from the world out there. You don't understand what this storm can do to a person. His voice softened for just a moment, and she could see the faintest flicker of something. Concern, perhaps, or was it something more? Clara's heart fluttered, but she refused to let herself be swayed. She had come here for safety, But how much of herself was she willing to give up in exchange for it? Protection, she repeated, taking a deep breath, trying to steady herself. You think I need protection from myself? Jackson's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes now, a flash of something deeper. I think you need protection from this place, from everything that's waiting for you out there. He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers, until the space between them felt as narrow as the cold, empty room. Clara's chest tightened. The words she wanted to speak lodged in her throat. The fire crackled in the silence, its warmth distant and faint. Her hands were shaking now, her mind racing, torn between the survival instinct that urged her to trust him and the burning desire to resist, to fight for control of her own fate. Jackson's hand, almost imperceptible, reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against her arm. The touch was almost gentle, but it held an unspoken weight, a claim she wasn't sure she was ready to accept. His touch sent a shock of warmth through her, and for a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't speak. She was trapped in the tension of that simple, quiet touch, feeling the way it ignited something deep inside her, something that made her want to push him away and pull him closer at the same time. You're not alone here. Jackson's voice was low, steady, like the rumble of distant thunder. And you're not free to just walk away from this. Not yet. Clara's breath hitched, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she met his gaze. His words were a challenge, a truth she didn't want to accept, but the power in his presence, in his control, was undeniable. The storm raged outside, but the storm inside her, the one he had stirred, was far more dangerous. The fire crackled again, and for a heartbeat, Clara stood frozen, caught between defiance and desire, between freedom and the safety she didn't know if she could trust. But one thing was clear. This moment would change everything. The decision was hers, but the stakes had never been higher. Could she accept his protection, or would the storm inside her be too strong to survive? The wind outside howled louder, the storm growing more violent with each passing minute. The cabin, though sturdy and warm, seemed fragile in the face of the raging cold. Clara sat near the fire, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on her face, highlighting the exhaustion in her eyes. The warmth from the flames was a sharp contrast to the chill in her bones, but it did little to calm the turmoil inside her. Jackson moved across the room, his presence a constant, heavy force she couldn't escape. He wasn't just a protector anymore. He was something more. She could feel the pull of his gaze, the weight of it pressing on her like the storm outside. She felt trapped, but not in the way she had before. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something deeper, something she wasn't ready to admit. Jackson's eyes locked on hers, his steady, unyielding gaze holding her in place. He wasn't saying anything, but he didn't need to. His silence was louder than any words could be. The space between them was shrinking with each second, the tension thickening like the air before a storm. Clara swallowed hard, the words she wanted to say caught in her throat. She had wanted to resist, to fight him, to maintain control. But the more time she spent in this cabin, in his presence, the more she felt herself losing that control. I don't need your protection, she said, her voice trembling slightly, betraying the confidence she tried to project. It wasn't a declaration of strength. It was a plea, a last attempt to hold on to something she could call her own. Jackson stepped closer, his boots barely making a sound on the wooden floor. His gaze never wavered, but something in his expression softened, just for a moment. You don't have a choice, he said quietly. Not anymore. Clara flinched, the words stinging more than she cared to admit. She wanted to argue, to fight him, to prove she didn't need anyone. But the truth was, she didn't know how long she could last out there in the storm. She wasn't sure she could make it on her own anymore. The loneliness, the cold, it was suffocating. She looked away, her eyes burning with the threat of tears she refused to shed. This wasn't her. She wasn't weak. She had to be strong, for herself. But in the warmth of the cabin, with Jackson standing so close, it felt like that strength was slipping through her fingers. You think I want this? She whispered, her voice barely audible. To be stuck here, with you, dependent on you? Jackson's expression hardened again, but there was something in his eyes now, something that made Clara's chest tighten. It wasn't pity. It was understanding. He knew exactly what she was feeling. I'm not asking you to depend on me, he said, his voice low, almost gentle. I'm giving you the chance to survive. Clara's heart beat faster, the air between them thick with unspoken words. She wanted to scream at him, to push him away, to claim her independence. But the truth was, she was scared. Scared of what would happen if she left. Scared of what would happen if she stayed. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The fire crackled softly in the background, the only sound in the heavy silence. Clara could feel the heat from the flames on her skin, but the warmth wasn't enough to chase away the coldness that had settled deep inside her. Jackson stepped forward, his presence looming over her. She could feel his breath, warm and steady, against her skin as he reached out, his hand brushing lightly against her shoulder. The touch was barely there, but it was enough to send a shiver down her spine. I'm not going to leave you out there, he murmured, his voice soft but firm. Clara looked up at him, her breath catching in her throat. His eyes were steady, unwavering, as if he had already made the decision for her. She wanted to push him away, to fight back, but the truth was, she didn't have the strength anymore. I know, she said, her voice barely a whisper. And in that moment, Clara realized something she had been trying to deny. She wasn't just scared of him, she was scared of needing him, scared of how much she wanted to believe in him. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, a different storm was beginning to stir, one neither of them could escape. And as Jackson's hand remained on her shoulder, Clara felt a shift, a subtle but undeniable change. She was no longer fighting for control. She was beginning to let go. But what would happen once she did? The storm outside had worsened, the wind howling like a pack of wolves, its icy breath clawing at the cabin's walls. The fire crackled weakly in the hearth, its warmth a fragile defense against the biting cold. The cabin, once a refuge, now felt like a cage, its walls pressing in on Clara and Jackson as the hours stretched long into the night. Every gust of wind rattled the windows, each one louder than the last. The temperature had dropped, and with it, their remaining supplies had dwindled. The cold was no longer just a threat outside. It had become a part of their reality, seeping into their bones, settling deep into their minds. Clara sat by the fire, staring into the flames, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She could feel the weight of the silence between them, as heavy as the snow outside. Jackson sat across from her, his posture rigid, his eyes always watching, always calculating. His presence, once comforting, now felt like a constant reminder of everything she was trying to escape. She wanted to be alone again, to be independent, to find her own way, but the storm had taken that choice from her. She could no longer pretend she wasn't dependent on him, but the fear still clawed at her. What if she trusted him? What if she let him in, only to have him abandon her, just like everyone else had? Her mind raced, the past bleeding into the present, the memories of her lost husband, of her failed attempts to survive on her own, flooding her thoughts. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if every part of her was laid bare before him. The fire flickered, casting shadows across the room. Jackson's eyes caught hers, and for a brief moment, she could see something there, something more than just control. Was it concern? Or something else? Asterisk, Clara, he said, his voice low, but there was an edge to it now, as if the silence had become unbearable. We're running out of supplies. The storm isn't letting up. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, her throat tight. The words she wanted to say, the anger, the fear, all of it, seemed stuck. But Jackson wasn't waiting for her response. He stood up slowly, crossing the small space between them, the sound of his boots on the wooden floor echoing in the silence. She could feel the heat from his body as he approached, his presence filling the room, making the air thicker, harder to breathe. I won't leave you out there, he said, his voice softer now, but no less firm. But you need to understand something. He paused, standing just in front of her, so close she could feel the warmth of him, could smell the leather of his coat mixed with the scent of smoke from the fire. His gaze never wavered. You don't get to push me away anymore. Not after what we've been through. Clara's heart skipped a beat, her chest tightening at the words. She felt the sting of something she didn't want to feel. Asterisk, dependence, asterisk. She hated it. She hated how easily she had come to rely on him, how the cold, the storm, had driven her into his arms without her even realizing it. But she couldn't deny the truth. She had nowhere else to go. She opened her mouth to speak, to argue, to try and push him away one last time, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she looked up at him, meeting his gaze, her breath shallow. The tension between them was almost unbearable now, the air crackling with unspoken things. She was afraid of what would happen if she stayed, but even more afraid of what would happen if she left. Jackson's hand reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, the touch gentle but firm. It wasn't a touch of affection. It was a touch of control, of ownership, of something neither of them had named yet. Clara flinched at the contact, but she didn't pull away. She didn't want to. He stepped back, his hand falling away, and for a moment, the space between them felt almost unbearable. The fire crackled behind her, the only warmth in the room, but it couldn't chase away the coldness that had settled in her chest. She wasn't just fighting the storm outside. She was fighting him, fighting the way he made her feel. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, until Jackson spoke again, his voice low, almost a growl. "You'll have to trust me if we're going to survive this." The words hit Clara like a punch to the gut, but she knew he was right. She had no choice. The storm outside was unforgiving, and the choices she made now would define her survival. She could fight him, fight the feeling that was building between them, or she could accept it, accept the protection, accept the danger, accept the uncertainty of what would come next. She looked away from him, her mind racing, the storm howling louder outside. And in the quiet, Clara knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The choices they made now would bind them together in ways they couldn't yet understand. And in that silence, Clara realized the true weight of their situation. They were both trapped, by the storm, by each other, and by the choices they had yet to make. But with every passing second, the danger was growing closer. The storm outside wasn't the only thing they had to fear. The stakes had never been higher, and the time for running was running out. The storm raged outside with a fury that seemed almost alive, its icy fingers clawing at the cabin as if it were determined to tear everything apart. The wind howled, a relentless screech that rattled the windows, shaking the very foundation of the small wooden structure. Inside, the fire had burned low, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. The warmth it offered was little comfort against the cold that seeped through the cracks in the walls. The storm had trapped them, locked them in this cabin, with nothing but each other and the storm for company. The space between Clara and Jackson had never felt more suffocating, the air thick with tension. Clara sat near the fire, her body tense, her mind racing. The fear, the doubt, it gnawed at her, pulling her in two directions. She wanted to run, to escape, but she couldn't ignore the pull of the man sitting across from her, his eyes never leaving her, like he was waiting for her to make the next move. She felt the weight of his gaze, steady and unwavering. He was waiting for her to choose, to either stay or leave, to trust him or face the storm alone. "Clara!" Jackson's voice broke the silence, low and firm, like the rumble of thunder in the distance. She looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that made her throat tighten. "You can't keep running." She felt a flash of anger rise in her chest. "I'm not running," she shot back, though her voice wavered. She wasn't sure if she was trying to convince him or herself. "I'm just not going to be trapped." Jackson's jaw tightened, and he leaned forward slightly, his movements slow, controlled, like a man who had learned how to wait for the right moment. "This isn't about being trapped, Clara. This is about survival." His words hung in the air between them, heavy and charged. The storm outside roared louder, but in that moment, the world inside the cabin felt smaller, the space between them closing with every passing second. Clara could feel the heat from the fire, but it wasn't enough to chase away the chill in her bones, the coldness that had settled deep in her chest. "You don't understand," Clara whispered, her voice breaking slightly. She looked away, unable to meet his eyes. "I can't depend on you." Jackson didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. His eyes never left her face, his gaze steady, unwavering. He knew what she was feeling. He could see the walls she had built around herself, the fear that had locked her away from trusting anyone, from trusting him. "I'm not asking you to. Depend on me," he said quietly, his voice softer now, but still carrying that same weight. "I'm asking you to survive." Clara's breath hitched, her chest tight. The words cut through her like a knife, sharp and raw. She wanted to fight him, to scream that she didn't need anyone, that she could survive on her own. But the truth was, she wasn't sure anymore. The storm outside, the isolation, it was all too much. And in Jackson's presence, the warmth, the steadiness, she felt something she hadn't felt in so long. Safety. But it came at a cost. She looked up at him, her eyes locking with his. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, something almost vulnerable, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by that familiar, unshakable calm. He wasn't asking her to give up everything. He was asking her to trust him, just for a moment, just long enough to survive. I don't know how to trust anymore, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to trust anyone. Jackson's expression softened, his eyes momentarily breaking from their intensity. But then he stood up, moving toward her with slow, deliberate steps. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. The air between them had become thick with the weight of their unspoken words, their conflicting emotions. He was so close now. She could feel the heat from his body, the warmth of his breath, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. Without a word, Jackson reached out, his hand gently brushing her hair away from her face, his fingers lingering just long enough to send a jolt of warmth through her. The touch was tender, almost protective, but there was something else there too. An unspoken promise. Clara's heart raced, her breath shallow, as she found herself frozen in the moment. She wanted to pull away, to push him out of her mind, out of her heart. But she couldn't. Not anymore. The storm outside howled louder, but it felt far away now, distant and insignificant in the face of the choice that lay before her. Would she leave, run from the safety he offered? Or would she stay and face the unknown with him, knowing that, for better or worse, they were bound together by the storm? The air was thick with the weight of her decision, and as Jackson's hand stayed near her face, his presence closing the gap between them, Clara knew one thing for certain. Whatever choice she made next would change everything. The fire had burned low, its glow now barely enough to illuminate the room, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and curl like ghosts on the walls. The storm outside had not let up. In fact, it felt as though it had intensified, the wind howling louder than ever, rattling the cabin as if it might tear the roof off. Inside, though, there was a stillness, a heavy, suffocating silence that hung in the air like a thick fog. Clara sat near the fire, her eyes fixed on the dying embers, but she didn't really see them. Her mind was somewhere far away, lost in the aftermath of the decision she had made. Jackson stood by the door, his back to her, his posture rigid. Neither of them spoke. The space between them felt vast, despite how small the cabin was. The distance was no longer just physical, it was emotional, and it was deepening with every passing second. Clara's chest ached. She could still feel the lingering warmth of his touch on her skin, but it only made the emptiness more pronounced. She had allowed him in, allowed herself to depend on him, but the cost of that decision was already weighing on her. She had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. Jackson hadn't moved since she had given in, his silence as heavy as the storm outside. His eyes had shifted from her when she had finally agreed to stay, but Clara could feel them on her, even now. She could feel him watching her, waiting for something. Maybe for her to speak, to acknowledge the change between them, to understand the weight of it. But Clara couldn't bring herself to look at him. She couldn't bear to face the reality of what had just happened. She had chosen to stay. She had chosen him. And that choice, it had irrevocably shifted something between them. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, everything was still. The air was thick, the silence pressing down on her chest, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost, that they had crossed a threshold, and the world beyond the door had changed forever. Clara's gaze flickered to Jackson, who still stood by the door, his arms crossed, his posture tense. He didn't seem to be waiting for her to speak, but Clara couldn't help but wonder if he was just as lost in his thoughts as she was. She was afraid to speak, afraid of what she might say, afraid of what he might say in return. The quiet stretched on, until the sound of the wind outside became unbearable, the howling wind mingling with the deafening silence between them. "I don't know what to do now," Clara whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Her voice was raw, as if she hadn't spoken in a long time. "I don't know how to be here. How to be this." Jackson didn't move at first, his gaze locked on the storm outside, but then he slowly turned toward her, his eyes meeting hers. There was a flicker of something in them, something soft, something she couldn't quite place. For a moment, neither of them spoke, but the silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the weight of the choice they had both made and the tension that had shifted between them. "You're not alone," Jackson said, his voice steady. But there was something else there, something that made Clara's heart tighten. She wasn't sure if it was comfort or something else entirely, but it didn't matter. She couldn't trust the words, couldn't trust herself to believe them. Not when everything she had known had been ripped away. Not when she was still so afraid of what trusting him would mean. But then, as Jackson took a step forward, she caught her breath. The air between them was thick with unsaid things, things that neither of them were ready to confront. His eyes never left hers, and for a long moment, it felt like they were the only two people in the world. The fire crackled behind them, but it didn't matter. Nothing in the world mattered except the weight of his presence, the silent pull between them. She couldn't do this anymore. The silence, the tension, the overwhelming sense of being trapped and needing. She had been running for so long. From the storm, from the past, from herself. But now, she had nowhere to go. "I don't know how to trust you," she said, her voice breaking the silence, softer now, almost pleading. "I don't know if I can." Jackson took another step closer, his expression unreadable. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just stood there, his presence like an anchor in the storm. "I'm not asking you to trust me," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. "I'm asking you to trust yourself." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know how to respond to that. How could she trust herself when everything she had been taught, everything she had believed, had led her to this moment? How could she trust herself when all she felt was fear? And then, as if the storm outside had somehow sensed the change, the wind howled louder, the door shuddering in its frame. A sharp, sudden knock echoed through the cabin, cutting through the silence like a warning. Clara's heart skipped a beat, her gaze snapping to the door. Jackson's expression hardened, and he moved toward it, his hand on the handle. The storm was not the only thing they had to fear anymore. The danger was closer than they realized. The unknown had just knocked on the door. The real test was just beginning. The knock at the door shattered the fragile silence like a gunshot in the still night. Clara's heart skipped a beat, the echo of it reverberating in her chest. Jackson froze, his hand still on the door handle, his body taut with sudden tension. He had not expected anyone. The storm had kept everyone inside, everyone except whoever stood on the other side of that door. Clara felt the weight of the moment shift, the air thick with anticipation. Jackson's eyes flickered toward her, searching her face for a reaction. But Clara, despite the fear that knotted in her stomach, felt something stir inside her, a decision she hadn't even known she'd made until now. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about control. She stood up slowly, her feet heavy against the creaky wooden floor. Jackson turned back to the door, his eyes still locked on her. But this time, something in them was different. There was a quiet uncertainty there, a vulnerability he had never shown before. It was a side of him she hadn't seen, and it unsettled her. She crossed the room, the distance between them now no longer just physical. She stopped just behind him, her presence a quiet force in the room. Was this her chance to change the game? To show him she wasn't just a passive player in his world? To take back some measure of control she hadn't realized she'd lost? The knock came again, louder this time, impatient. Clara glanced at Jackson, her eyes steady, her pulse racing. What would happen if she stepped forward now? If she made the decision, instead of waiting for him to dictate the terms? "Don't answer it," Clara said, her voice calm, but carrying a weight that felt like it could break the silence. Jackson looked at her, his brow furrowing in confusion. He didn't speak immediately, his lips pressed together in that familiar, thoughtful way. It was as if her words had cut through something deeper, something he hadn't expected to face. He turned back to the door, but Clara could see it in his eyes, the flicker of hesitation, the faintest crack in the armor he had built around himself. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Clara's breath came shallow, but she didn't step back. This wasn't just about the storm outside anymore. It was about the storm inside her, the way she had let him take control, the way she had let herself be swept along. But now, standing there in the dim light of the cabin. She realized she couldn't keep doing it. She wasn't his to control. "I said don't answer it," she repeated, her voice firmer now. She stepped forward, closing the space between them, her presence filling the small cabin. Jackson didn't move, but she could feel the weight of his gaze on her, like the weight of the storm pressing down on them both. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jackson's hand was still on the door, but his body had stiffened, a silent conflict flickering in his eyes. Clara could feel the shift in the air, the tension thickening like a cloud before a lightning strike. "I don't need saving," Clara said quietly, but with a fierce certainty. Jackson turned, finally meeting her gaze. His eyes softened, but there was something else there, something she hadn't expected. Regret? Realization? It was hard to say. But in that instant, she saw him. Not just the cowboy with the hardened exterior, but the man who had been carrying the weight of too many secrets for too long. "I never said you did," he replied, his voice low, almost as if he were talking to himself. Clara felt the distance between them shift again, but this time, it wasn't the physical space that mattered. It was the unspoken understanding that had settled between them. He wasn't the only one who needed to let go, and she wasn't the only one who had something to protect. Just as the moment seemed to freeze, the door cracked open. Clara's heart skipped. Her pulse quickened. Jackson's hand remained on the knob, but this time, there was no hesitation in his movements. His eyes, though, were still on Clara, as if waiting for her to make the next move. The door swung wide, and the storm outside seemed to crash in with it. The harsh wind hit their faces, and through the doorway, a figure stood. Familiar, but unexpected. The sight of him made Clara's breath catch in her throat. Jackson's face darkened instantly, the calm resolve he had been holding onto slipping away like sand through his fingers. "Here's the thing," the man said, his voice cutting through the wind. "I think it's time we talked about who's really in control here." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. What had she just stepped into? The wind outside roared like a living thing, its icy fingers clawing at the cabin as if it sought to tear it apart. The snow swirled in chaotic flurries, battering the small, fragile structure with all the fury of a world that seemed intent on erasing them both. Inside, the fire flickered weakly, casting long, twisting shadows that danced along the walls, adding to the suffocating sense of confinement. Clara stood near the window, her back rigid, staring out into the storm as if the howling wind could somehow give her answers. Jackson stood across from her, his face shadowed, his eyes unreadable. The space between them had never felt so vast, so impossible to cross. The tension between them was palpable, thickening with each passing second, each breath drawn in the cold air. Clara's heart raced in her chest. She had tried to convince herself that this wasn't about him, about them. But the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside her, a tempest of emotions that she couldn't control. What was she really afraid of? The choice to leave, to run, had always felt like freedom. But now, standing here, the weight of that decision was crushing. She had stayed, had allowed herself to be pulled into his world, and in doing so, had created a tether she wasn't sure she could break. Jackson's eyes remained on her, his gaze unwavering, as if waiting for her to make the next move. But Clara could feel it, the unspoken battle between them. She could feel how he was holding himself back, keeping something in check, something she couldn't quite name. It was almost as if he was offering her a choice, but not in words. His silence, his presence, was a force of its own, pushing against her, drawing her in. The storm outside wasn't the only thing that threatened to tear them apart. It was the space between them, the words left unspoken, the distance created by the choices they had both made. "I can't keep doing this," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper, but sharp with the weight of her decision. She turned to face him, her breath quickening. The fire crackled behind her, the sound suddenly deafening. "I can't keep pretending that this," she gestured between them, her hands trembling slightly, "is something it's not." Jackson's expression didn't change. He remained still, his posture unwavering. But there was a flicker in his eyes, something that spoke of long-held restraint. He stepped forward slowly, his boots making no sound on the floor. The distance between them closed, but Clara didn't move. She wasn't sure if she was ready to let him get any closer. "You don't have to pretend, Clara," Jackson said softly, his voice a low rumble. I never asked you to. His words hit her like a physical blow. She swallowed hard, the air in the room thick with tension, the storm outside mirroring the whirlwind inside her. He was right. He hadn't asked her to pretend, but she had been pretending, hadn't she? Pretending that she could keep up the wall between them, pretending that she didn't feel the pull of his presence, the warmth of his touch. But the truth was, she was tired. Tired of running. Tired of hiding from the feelings she didn't want to acknowledge. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside her, the raging conflict between the need for freedom and the desire for connection. Then what is this? Clara asked, her voice thick with emotion. What is it that you want from me? Jackson's gaze softened for a moment, his eyes searching hers. There was something raw in them now, something that spoke of a pain he had kept buried for so long. He stepped closer, so close now that Clara could feel the heat of his body, the steady rhythm of his breath. He reached out, his hand hovering just above her arm, the touch barely there, but it was enough to make her heart race. I want you to stop running from me, Jackson said quietly. I want you to stop running from yourself. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what to say, how to respond to that. His words, so simple, but so profound, struck something deep inside her, something she hadn't been ready to face. She had been running for so long, running from her past, from the fear of being hurt again, from the fear of needing someone. But now, standing there, with him so close, she realized she didn't want to run anymore. Not from him. Not from this. But just as the realization hit her, a sudden sound broke through the stillness. A sharp, unmistakable knock at the door. Clara's heart skipped a beat. Jackson froze, his gaze snapping toward the door, his body tensing like a coiled spring. This time, there was no hesitation in his movements. His hand gripped the door handle, his expression hardening, the protective instinct she had seen before returning. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating, as Clara stood frozen, her mind racing. What now? Had everything she had just realized been for nothing? Were they about to be thrown back into the storm, both outside and in? Jackson paused, his hand still on the door, his eyes meeting hers one last time before he opened it. The storm outside rushed in with a roar, and the figure standing in the doorway made Clara's heart stop. This wasn't just anyone. This was someone from Jackson's past, someone who had come to change everything once again. And as Jackson's eyes hardened, Clara knew the stakes had just been raised higher than either of them had ever expected. The choices they had made, the choices they would have to make now. Asterisk, asterisk, they would decide everything. Asterisk, asterisk, the storm outside had finally quieted, leaving only the soft whisper of wind as it threaded through the cracks in the cabin. The world beyond the door was still, blanketed in snow, the sky a pale gray as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. The air was cold, but the fire inside had burned down to little more than a few smoldering embers, its warmth no longer enough to cut through the chill in the room. Clara sat on the floor, her back to the fading glow, her eyes focused on the cold ashes. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, the weight of the past days pressing down on her like a heavy stone. Jackson stood by the window, his figure outlined against the pale light of the morning. His expression was unreadable, his posture still, as though he were searching the quiet for something that might never come. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with everything that had happened, the choices they had made, the decisions they had lived with, the things they had said to each other that they could never take back. But now, with the storm outside gone and the world beginning to stir again, everything felt quieter, softer somehow. As if the earth itself had taken a deep breath, waiting for something. Clara shifted slightly, her eyes lifting to meet Jackson's. He turned slowly, his gaze finding hers with an intensity that had never been there before. Not the harshness of control or the weight of expectations, but something else. Something more vulnerable. You're still here, she said, her voice hoarse, as if the words had been waiting on the tip of her tongue for far too long. Jackson's gaze softened, and for the first time in days, Clara saw the man she had been afraid to see. Not the protector, not the cowboy, not the man who had kept her in this cabin with the force of his will, but the man who had been holding something back. The man who was tired. I'm not going anywhere, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to. Not anymore. Clara felt something shift within her, a weight lifting from her chest. She didn't know if it was because of the storm finally ending or because of his words. Maybe it was both. But she realized then, for the first time, that she had been waiting for this. She had been waiting for him to say it, to stop pretending, to stop keeping her at arm's length with his silence, with his control. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked at him, seeing him differently now. The man who had once seemed so distant, so untouchable, was now standing in front of her, his eyes open, his walls finally coming down. "I don't know if I can trust you," Clara said, her voice trembling with the weight of the truth. "But I think I can trust myself now." Jackson didn't move, didn't speak at first. He just looked at her, as if he were trying to understand what she was saying, trying to understand what was happening between them. Then, without a word, he stepped closer, his footsteps slow and deliberate, his presence pulling her in without a sound. She could feel the heat from his body, the quiet certainty in his every movement. When he reached her, he didn't touch her at first. He just stood there, close enough that Clara could feel the rhythm of his breath matching her own. It was as if they were both waiting for something to shift, for the moment to come. Finally, Jackson spoke, his voice softer than before, filled with something unspoken. "I don't want to control you, Clara. I just want you to stay." The simplicity of his words hit her harder than anything else. She had spent so long trying to keep her distance, trying to hold on to her independence, but in that moment, she realized something. She didn't have to choose between being free and being with him. She could have both. She could stand on her own and still be with him, still trust him. Clara nodded slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid to face it. Jackson reached out then, his hand brushing gently against her cheek, a simple, quiet touch that spoke more than words ever could. She closed her eyes for a moment, leaning into his touch, feeling the weight of everything they had both been through. It wasn't about giving up control. It was about choosing to trust, to stay. In the stillness of the cabin, with the storm finally silenced, Clara realized that some choices weren't about running or staying. They were about accepting what was right in front of you. And in that moment, she chose to stay, not just for the storm outside, but for what was inside, the connection that had started in the quiet, in the shared breaths, and the shared moments of vulnerability. The tension between them had dissolved, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they were both finally at peace. But even as Clara let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, she knew that the story between them wasn't over. It had only just begun, and whatever came next, they would face it together. But before she could speak again, there was a sound from outside, faint but distinct. A shadow crossed the door, and the quiet that had settled between them seemed to fracture just for a moment. The storm had passed, but something else was approaching, something neither of them had expected. A new challenge, a new uncertainty that would push them both to their limits once again. But for now, as the first light of morning touched the snow outside, all they could do was wait. The journey ahead would be theirs to face, side by side. The light of dawn had filtered through the cracks in the cabin's wooden walls, casting pale beams across the floor. The snow outside had turned the world a muted white, the morning light dim and cold, like the world was still waking up from a long, restless night. The fire had nearly died, leaving only the faintest warmth in the air. The silence inside the cabin was thick, heavy with the weight of everything that had passed between them. Jackson stood by the window, his back to Clara, staring out into the stillness of the morning. His posture was less rigid now, less guarded. The sharp edges of his expression had softened, the tension that had clung to him for days, weeks even, now dissipating. But still, there was something unsaid, something that lingered like the last remnants of the storm outside. Clara sat near the hearth, her hands resting on her knees, staring into the dim glow of the remaining embers. She had never felt more distant from the woman she used to be. The walls she had built around herself, the walls she thought would protect her, had come down in the silence of the night. And now, she didn't know who she was anymore, not without them. But she also knew she wasn't the same person who had walked into this cabin. Not anymore. Not after everything that had happened. The space between them felt lighter now, but there was still a lingering weight in the air. It wasn't the crushing pressure of the past, the tension of control and fear. It was something else. Something softer, more intimate. The kind of silence that only existed when two people had reached an understanding, when they had shared their fears, their vulnerabilities, and come out the other side. But it was also the silence before something else. Something they both knew was coming. Jackson turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers. There was a gentleness there now, an openness that hadn't been there before. His gaze was steady, searching her face, as if waiting for her to say something. But Clara didn't know what to say. She didn't have the words. So instead, she just looked at him, letting the silence stretch between them, letting the moment linger. He took a step forward, his boots soft against the wooden floor. Clara didn't move, but she didn't pull away either. She stayed where she was, watching him, feeling the warmth of his presence even in the cold of the room. "Are you okay?" Jackson asked, his voice low, but soft. The question was simple, yet it held more weight than any question had before. It wasn't just about the storm, about surviving the night. It was about something deeper, something that neither of them had fully acknowledged yet. Clara took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her lungs, but the weight of his question settled into her chest. For the first time, she realized something. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, and she hadn't done that in a long time. "I think I'm starting to be," she said quietly, her voice still raw but steady. Jackson nodded, as if he understood, as if he'd been waiting for her to say it, to admit it to herself. He took another step closer, and this time, there was no tension, no hesitation. Just the quiet certainty that had been building between them since the storm had first brought them together. Clara lifted her eyes to meet his, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The space between them felt vast, but it also felt familiar, like they were finally settling into something that had been there all along. The tension, the push and pull between them, had reached its breaking point. Now it was gone. Without a word, Jackson reached out, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it was everything. Clara felt her breath catch in her throat, the connection between them suddenly so real, so undeniable. She hadn't realized how much she had needed this simple act of reassurance, of trust. "You don't have to face it alone," Jackson said softly, his voice steady, but filled with something more. Clara didn't reply at first. She didn't need to. The way he looked at her, the way he stood there, so close and yet so patient, it was enough. The fire crackled softly behind them, the light from the hearth casting a warm glow across the room. The storm outside had faded into the distance, and in its place, there was only the quiet of the morning, the quiet of the two of them, standing together in the aftermath of everything that had happened. Clara's hand found its way to his, her fingers brushing against his, a simple touch, but one that spoke volumes. And in that moment, as the light of the new day bathed the cabin, Clara realized that the journey ahead, whatever it held, was one they would face together. The storm had passed, and with it, so had the darkness. The choices they had made had led them here, but now, the only choice that mattered was what came next. And for the first time in a long while, Clara felt ready to face it, ready to take the next step. But even as the first light of dawn stretched across the snow-covered world outside, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that their story was far from over. And whatever happened next, she knew one thing for certain. Asterisk, she wouldn't be facing it alone. Asterisk, the sun dipped low over the vast expanse of the prairie, casting long, golden shadows across the wide open land. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind only the soft whispers of the wind and the quiet rustling of the dry grasses. The world was vast, endless, and for the first time in a long while, Clara didn't feel alone in it. Jackson rode beside her, their horses moving steadily through the grass, the rhythmic clip-clop of hooves the only sound in the peaceful silence. The air was warm now, the chill of the storm long gone, and the sky above was clear, painted in hues of orange and purple as the sun began its slow descent behind the mountains. There were no more threats, no more shadows lurking on the horizon. The dangers of the past few days had faded into the distance, like the storm clouds that had once darkened their world. Now, all that remained was the quiet of the open land, and the quiet of their connection. Clara's gaze drifted across the sweeping prairie, her eyes following the curve of the earth where it met the sky. There was something freeing about the openness, about the endless horizon stretching before them. It was a vast world, full of possibilities, and yet, For the first time, Clara didn't feel the need to escape it. She didn't need to run anymore. She had made her choice. She had chosen to stay, and with that choice, she had found a kind of peace she hadn't even realized she was searching for. Beside her, Jackson rode silently, his presence steady and reassuring. The tension that had once hung between them was gone now, replaced by something softer, something more grounded. She glanced over at him, catching the profile of his face as he looked ahead, his expression thoughtful but calm. There were no walls between them now, no more need for masks or pretenses. They had both let go of the things that had held them apart. He turned his head toward her, his eyes meeting hers, and for a moment, there was only the sound of the wind between them. There was no need for words. The quiet had become their language, the spaces between their glances speaking volumes. In the stillness of the vast prairie, with the world spread out before them, Clara realized how far they had come, from the isolation of their separate worlds to this moment of quiet understanding. "Thank you," Clara said softly, the words more for herself than for him. She had come here to survive, but now, she realized, it wasn't just survival that mattered. It was this quiet, this peace, this connection. Jackson didn't reply immediately. Instead, he simply nodded, his eyes flicking briefly to the land ahead. He didn't need to say anything. His presence, the way he had stayed beside her, had already said everything that needed to be said. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in fiery colors, Jackson urged his horse forward, and Clara followed. The world stretched out before them, vast and open, but for the first time, she didn't feel afraid of it. She didn't feel small in the face of it. With Jackson by her side, the land didn't seem so overwhelming anymore. It wasn't the freedom she had once longed for, the kind of freedom that came from running away. It was a different kind of freedom, the freedom that came from facing the world together, from sharing the journey instead of walking it alone. The wind picked up again, the cool evening air carrying the scent of the earth, the grasses, the wildness of the land. But in that moment, as Clara and Jackson rode side by side, the prairie no longer felt so wild. It felt like home. And for the first time, Clara realized that home wasn't just a place, it was a person. As the shadows lengthened and the sun finally sank beneath the horizon, Clara couldn't help but smile. The world was still a vast, unpredictable place, but now, with Jackson beside her, she knew she could face whatever came next. Because sometimes, the greatest freedom was not in running away, but in staying. And in staying, they had found something more valuable than all the open land in the world. They had found each other. The night settled in around them, quiet and still, as the two of them rode on into the unknown, their futures unwritten but intertwined in a way that neither of them had ever expected. The journey was far from over, but they would face it together, and that was all that mattered. Because, in the end, it was not the storm or the land that defined them. It was the choices they made, the trust they gave, and the bond they had built. And that bond was stronger than anything the world could throw their way.